Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb.
And I'm Becky Scherr.
Today's episode is not what we originally planned. Becky and I had intended to return to covering the latest political news. Still, in light of the continued heartbreak and impact of what happened 10 days ago, we felt it was essential to take one more moment to reflect, to be candid, and to speak directly about the state's tragedy in losing Speaker Emeritus Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark, and the shooting of Senator John Hoffman and his wife, Yvette. This episode will be respectful but honest. We'll discuss the upcoming funeral, how Minnesotans can pay their respects, and how communities across the state are still grieving. We'll also confront the hard truth about political violence, its rise, its consequences, and how we begin to respond with purpose and decency. We'll be back next week with our usual political breakdowns, but for now, we just ask for a little more of your time to remember, reflect, and consider how we move forward. Thank you for joining us today. Becky, as I noted in the intro, this is not what we had expected, but I thought it was, and I appreciate your just pausing a bit and not continuing our normal broadcasting as we normally do. There's some great and amazing political things going on, which we'll discuss and get into next week. But in light of events, I didn't feel comfortable just doing another normal show.
I completely agree. And, I really appreciate I messaged you to the effect the other day, but really appreciate you taking the lead on this, not just on this podcast, but on Twitter and in actual real life conversations. You've been a good resource to members. You've been a good resource to politicos and operatives and folks just wondering and feeling uncertain and feeling weird about where they stand and grieving and feeling afraid and all of the feelings, all of the emotions. And you, I feel like, have been a really kind of steady hand and steady person for folks to go to lean on, to converse with. And so on behalf of everyone, thank you for that, because I think people need a little bit of safe spots to go to right now.
I appreciate that, Becky. I've had a lot of conversations, some in-person meetings, a lot of phone conversations with both Democrat and Republican legislators since the tragic events of almost now 2 weeks ago. It is simply amazing how time just stops still. And, just to reflect on some of those conversations, and we'll talk more about it in the show, but I think, and it's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this, I just didn't feel comfortable moving on yet. I think that the events of what Minnesota has experienced and some of the emotion that will happen over the next few days, it just seemed like it was important to continue to pause one more time. And I just want to say at the onset that my thoughts and prayers continue to be with the Hortman family, with the Hoffmans as they recover, and to legislators on both sides of the aisle in Minnesota who feel unsafe and feel that they have a lot of questions to ask themselves. That also extends to staff. There's a lot of staffers who lives have been turned upside down, and they were staff who was close to Speaker Hortman and the Hoffmans and legislative staff on both sides who are, I think, going through something simply unimaginable. Sadly, but historically, Melissa Hortman will be the first woman in Minnesota to lie in state at the state capitol. Both she and her husband will be lie in state along with their golden retriever Gilbert at the state capitol on this Friday from noon to 5. It's going to offer Minnesotans a chance to pay their final respects. It is historic, but just simply so tragic. And the visuals of that, I think, are going to be just, again, historic, but absolutely just heartbreaking. And there'll be a private service for the Hortman family that will be at 10:30 on Saturday and will be live streamed at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety's YouTube channel. And so that's where we're at with the service for them. There was a candlelit vigil last week. I stopped by for just a few minutes. It was just just so quiet, yet there was music, There were people standing around. It was a candlelit vigil. But what surprised me, and what not surprised is the wrong word, but what I found so remarkable is the people that were there. There were 1,000+ people that were at that event, at that candlelit vigil, and many of the people that had been targeted were on that list, and they were standing there, and they were standing in the open, and there was a lot of security, but I can't imagine standing there and being a part of that memorial service, that candlelit vigil, I should say, and had my name been on the list. It was it was easy to get to. We have an open Capitol complex and grounds, and there's going to be some discussions about some of that as we move forward. But it was a pretty open event, and I think about the psychological strength it took and the bravery it took for people whose name were on the list to show up and stand in public and honor Speaker Hortman, her husband, and acknowledge the tragedy that others and pain that others are experiencing. It was pretty remarkable.
I completely agree. In conversations I've had with you and others, it's just unimaginable to go through what mental, obstacle courses these individuals have to go through right now on a day-to-day basis. The amount of courage and bravery and strength it took to be there to support their colleagues and their friends, and to have somebody, some of that themselves, but also to show the strength of, we will not be bullied, we will not back down, this is not going to get us, you cannot win. The kind of elusive you right now, right? The enemies, anybody hoping to do threat or to do harm among or to elected officials, and to be able to have the strength to do that while also battling their inner demons of I just can't imagine. I just really cannot fathom how. I'm a scaredy cat on a day-to-day basis. I live with just anxiety of being a human, but in this situation, I just cannot fathom how the strength that it takes to get in your car, to drive to the Capitol, to be there in such a vulnerable state, knowing that somebody truly not only wanted you dead, but had plans to potentially see through to that. And so it's just remarkable. As you said, it looked like a beautiful event, and the amount of people that came out, whose lives were obviously touched by Speaker Hortman and her husband, the work that they have done, and what they represent. A lot of individuals who have never encountered either of them, never met them day to day, in addition to all of their friends and loved ones. It's clear that these two were remarkable individuals who have made a lasting impact on many, many lives and lives for years and years to come.
Absolutely. We've had some developments related to other threats. Sadly, we had a lobbyist who was arrested, was charged with felony threats of violence after allegedly sending text messages declaring plans to bring a gun and 500 bullets to the state capitol. Jonathan Bone of Woodbury, he's a lobbyist. He was charged in Carver County, and I believe was released on bond. That came out a couple days after the assassination of Hortman and the shooting of the Hoffmans. But it seems, and I'm not an agent of law enforcement or anything like that, but it seems that this was some text exchanges, some text messages, but it was some very, very blunt, raw social media messages and other texts and things that in any type of climate should scare the hell out of people. But in the aftermath of what happened, it brings an entirely different context and reality to this situation.
Absolutely. I was absolutely shocked to see this. I worked for Congressman Emmer and a number of different legislators and candidates over the years, and there were times that we would see different threats on social media or emails, and would report them, and law enforcement or security would go and dig deep into this and see if it was an actual threat that needs to have further action, or if it was just some troll on the internet. This was obviously something that the police thought was more of a valid threat, that they needed to take further action. The text messages are striking, and then the the story he weaved afterwards, that this was a former acquaintance and a friend who he was just a little fired up of some stuff he saw on social media regarding the Hortman assassination, and he was just kind of blowing off some steam. Now, this certainly does not seem to be the case. It was very, very pointed conversations with actual seemingly plans, and it was really, really horrific to see. And thankfully this person did report it, and it was the individual who received these text messages said, they haven't communicated in quite a while, and that this person does a lot of work up at the Capitol, and so was obviously very afraid. He said he was out to dinner when he received the victim, when the victim received the text messages, and chose to leave dinner because they were so distraught over what they were receiving, especially in light of the situation. This is absolutely unacceptable. Everybody should know better. Somebody who claims to be a Democrat or a Politico that was close to the situation and was offended by somebody saying something against the Hortmans, it doesn't mesh with me that this was the action that they took, because this seems to be completely on the other side, in the face of what somebody who would be horrified by the assassination, as we all are, that's the threat you make. It just seems it's really, really disturbing.
I would agree. And, when we first talked about this last week, I had said that it's important to give, that people are going to be angry, and we need to give people space to be angry and mourn. This is not what I meant. Going out and making these types of threats, and in any context, it would be horrible. But certainly in the light of what happened, and the specifics, it was just chilling. And it is the access that people have between their brain and their keyboard and texting can cause a lot of damage and a lot of problem and a lot of fear. And I'm thankful that this person was apprehended, was charged. These are allegations. They will have their day in court, but it was pretty serious. And again, never a good time for that type of stuff to come out, but particularly in the aftermath of what Minnesota was just recovering from, and still will be. It was just difficult to read.
I mean, it's also one of those situations now that you shouldn't even joke about this, even if it's with your best friend. I mean, this is something that I feel like a high school student via Snapchat gets in trouble for, right? Making some comment off the cuff that what he's saying happened. You just don't even joke about this, especially when you are literally days after this horrible horror film-esque plot that played out. You don't joke, you don't say anything serious, and I'm so glad that the individual who received these did not take it as a joke, did not make light of it, and reported it.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to try to do in this episode, for the length of it, is I want to try to humanize people, because I think there's a lot of dehumanization going on, particularly on social media and in other places. And the acts that the assassination of Hortman was inhumane. The targeting of the Hoffmans was inhumane, and the entire activities of the alleged shooter is simply just inhumane and depraved. And it goes into the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which was Star Tribune wrote a lengthy story about how Minnesota legislators are thinking about their jobs and how they approach this. And without getting into specifics, this was some of the subjects that I've discussed with some legislators, is how they continue. Will they feel comfortable continuing? And is it worth the risk? I thought this article was incredibly insightful and showed, the story was discussed that when police knocked on Minnesota Senator Jim Abler's door about 3 a.m. Saturday, he didn't think twice about walking out in his pajamas to talk to the officer. But after learning that a gunman had killed Hortman and shot her husband, and then Hoffman and his wife, Abler said other public officials can no longer be trusting. It's nothing we've ever had to think before, the Anoka Republican had said. And that's something I wanted to discuss a bit today, is that this situation, if we don't find a way to humanize it and talk about it in real terms and talk about the political realities of what occurred and the institutional realities and what this could mean, this could have a real impact on where this state goes if we allow ourselves to not humanize this and talk about this. And please push back if my humanizing it is wrong or is offbeat. But what I worry about is good legislators of both sides. There's knuckleheads on both sides, and there's good folks on both sides. And what I'd hate to see happen is a legislator say it's not worth it. And I don't know every legislator at the state capitol. I couldn't name them. I don't know them all, and I certainly haven't met them. But any legislator and anyone who serves in public office making a decision about whether to serve as to whether they need to think about this type of nightmarish situation that occurred at the Hortmans and at the Hoffmans, that's now reality. It's not as simple as just answering the door anymore when you think it's law enforcement. And we as a state, I think, need to recognize that we're no longer the same way we were, that we've lost that Minnesota nice, some of that Minnesota exceptionalism that we think we all have. Behind me is the front cover of former Governor Wendy Anderson on the cover of Time magazine talking about the good life in Minnesota. And that's not the reality for a lot of people, particularly legislators. And we'll link to the Star Tribune story, but it had concerns from both sides of the aisle about Democrats and Republicans. And I think we need to just hit this head on. I think we need to talk about making sure that legislators and elected officials and staff feel safe, and that we all, I think, have a collective responsibility to dial our rhetoric down, make sure we're contributing and engaging civilly. But bottom line, this is getting out of hand. And I think that independent of the brutality that we saw 10 days ago, almost 2 weeks ago, the article notes that the Brenner Center said intimidation of public officials is on the rise, threats are on the rise. And so aside from the incident we have here in Minnesota, the data shows that nationally, this type of activity is on the rise. And boy, it's something that we need to talk about and address.
I completely agree. There are a lot of good people on both sides of the aisle, like you mentioned, who I wouldn't be surprised if we see a larger number of retirements in the coming years. We're going into an election year. I wouldn't be surprised if there are fewer numbers of individuals who choose to run. It is already like we talked about last week, a sacrifice for so many reasons to run for public office and to put yourself through that. And in the Minnesota legislature, being the part-time legislature that it's supposed to be, it's not like it's a raking in the dough to do this. And so there are a lot of benefits, pros, cons to weigh in general, aside from all of this. And then you add this layer into it, and it certainly is going to impact the legislative body that we have in the coming years, if not coming decades, which is really unfortunate because this is truly what the future of our state means, and and on a grander scale, what the future of our country means and how it's going to be built and laid out and planned for. And so there are some real impacts that this could have. And so conversations do need to be had to figure out how to make this, to keep everyone safe, but how to tone that down, because truly the future depends on it, right? I mean, it is the individuals who are beginning crafting our policies that are going to impact my children's lives more than my life. And so I think it's really important that we have a level head and we have some honest, frank conversations with left, right, and center, with everybody across the board to figure out what that is. And unfortunately, it is going to need to be bigger than just what conversations are being had on this podcast at the Minnesota legislature, right? We need to figure out how this is going to be taking place across the country at the federal level, how we can make sure that things are toned down, that we are able to work together. And I'm excited to, in next week's episode, talk about some recent poll results that I think play into that too. But it's been trending this way. And I like to think of politics as kind of a pendulum, and like we often swing far one way and come back. I feel like we've been kind of swinging this way for the last decade plus, and I'm really ready for it to come back, and I'm hopeful that we can get there. But the conversations need to start and action needs to start, because things are going to be changing sooner than later based on the individuals who are running for office, who get into office in the next 2, 4, 10 years. And so if we do not make this a priority on a large scale, it's who knows what's going to happen.
You worked in Congress, you worked at the legislature. Would you have concerns today about working in Congress or working at the legislature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I left politics largely because I have a specific job and the toxicity there. But one of the things that was trending to push me out, that I've talked to a little bit about, is also the toxicity and on social media. So my job as communications director for Congressman Emmer and for the Republican Party of Minnesota, I had to spend a decent amount of time reading emails from everybody, reading tweets, reading social media posts, comments, replies, and it wore on me. It really, I mean, I would wake up in the morning and just have anxiety and just kind of fear as I would see the badge number over my Twitter app of what I'm going to see when I open it. And I had I had to, that was my job. So I had to kind of sink myself into reading these horrific things that people would then also start targeting me. And that was at a time when my job was behind the scenes. I was not supposed to be out there. Who am I? I'm just somebody, writing press releases and tweets. And, it's not, I was not out in front. I was not having an election certificate. I was not putting myself on the ballot. And it really started to wear me down, and something that definitely played a role in me wanting to take a step back. And after I left politics back in when was that? 2019, 2020, I turned off all of my social media notifications. I really largely stepped away. I didn't really tweet for almost a year. It was something that I needed to get my mental health back and, strong. And so much has changed since then in just 5 years of what people think. And especially, I will say, not especially, it's on both sides. We have horrific trolls on social media on absolutely both sides. For me, one thing that I struggled with was also being a Republican and what people attribute to Republicans in this day and age, and especially when it comes to some of the social issues. And I felt like anytime if I met somebody new and somebody would introduce me as working for the Republican Party of Minnesota or Congressman Emmer or in Republican politics, I felt like I immediately needed to kind of defend myself, or that, this person was already going to be looking at me, thinking of me, talking behind my back. And so in this day and age, I think there is certainly, I don't know that I'm not looking to put myself back in that arena by any means. But if I was still in it, I would probably largely think about taking myself out of the political arena.
Yes, I think social media is one of those things that we're going to get to a point where we're going to realize we should have, the benefits of it are just not there. I think it's going to be like smoking. As I brought up before, the Flintstones once did a TV commercial for smoking and not realizing the harm. And I think social media is going to be like that. I think it warps people's minds. It makes social interactions and interactions in general much more inhumane. But before I get to more on social media, I want to highlight some good things that were done. I wrote a commentary for MinPost about Republican legislators who went out there and tamped down misinformation and also provided a sense of clarity and humanity to the situation. Representative Franzen, Representative Nolan West, Leader Harry Niska, Representative Niska, former Senator Paul Gazelka, and Senator Duckworth from Lakeville were the legislators that I highlighted. And they went out and took some heat, but also took a stand. And That's the type of thing that needs to happen. And I was really proud of those Republican legislators who went out there and took a stand for civility, took a stand and offered some moral clarity. I think each of them, Representative Franzen and Representative Nolan West and Representative Niska, former Senator Gazelka, and again, particularly Senator Duckworth with some pictures, just really, I think, offered a sense of humanity and understanding to the gravity of the situation. And in the ugliness of social media, those elected officials stood up and policed just an unhealthy medium and just did a remarkable job in in bringing a sense again of humanity, which is something I wanted to talk about this episode. Just a sense of humanity and human interaction back to a platform that is just filled with ugliness and rewards sometimes the ugliness in our world. Your take.
I love this piece that you wrote. I think it's great to lift up these voices that are pushing back. There's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation swirling out there. And I think would be easier for a lot of these individuals to stay quiet. And especially, I think some of the names that you listed are individuals that we expect, whether in 2026 or in the future, to run for a higher office of some sort. And I think these are the things that they've been criticized from Republican delegates and Republican activists. Some, not all. I don't want to lump all Republican delegates and activists together, but have definitely seen some pushback because, like Harry Niska's mentioned, that he's going to continue to criticize Governor Walz, but it is wrong to attribute this shooter, this assassin, and his plot with Governor Walz. Something that should be so mainstream, so it seems so simple to say it is not Governor Walz's fault that Speaker Hortman was killed, but apparently it needs to be said. And I'm glad that some of these leaders within the Republican Party have found the strength and courage and moral compass to stand up and to speak out and to make their voices heard on this and to help do what you were talking about. And what we were talking about is needing leaders in this realm to do just that.
Correct. And I want to speak to the opposite side of the coin for a second and just say a few things. All you have to do in this situation, in the aftermath of this mass tragedy, let me say this in the most respectful way. What occurred was horrific. It's unimaginable. It's a terror. That makes your ability to recognize that ugliness so much easier. It's not that difficult for you to just be normal and know how to respond. ChatGPT exists. If you don't know how to do it, just run it through a computer program. But I have to tell you, for all of the positive in humanity, part of the reason that these legislators that I mentioned and referenced in the story needed to be highlighted is because social media became an absolute cesspool of misinformation and ugliness, the likes of which I've never seen before. And it is really showed, it became just a toxic poison. When Paul Wellstone died, I was working at the Republican Party of Minnesota. I was the research director. I saw Wellstone speak. First of all, I worked on Boschwitz's race in '96, so I got to know Wellstone and some of his staff. And I don't want to pretend by any stretch of the imagination that we were cordial, we were respectful, but he didn't really like me, and I certainly didn't like his agenda. And we were there meeting for different reasons. Then I was the research director at the party. I saw Wellstone speak a lot in 2002, more than probably most Democrats did. And I knew his staff. I knew some of the staff that died. I knew him. I knew Wellstone. And when that plane crash happened, and the Republican Party that day did a couple of things. We shut things down. We prayed. We grieved. There was staff that cried. We didn't go out and just figure out how we could weaponize and politicize this situation. We didn't, thankfully, social media didn't exist. But let me tell you something. We said prayers. We prayed. We cried. It was gut-wrenching. And not at any point did any of us sit around and say, okay, now it's time to push conspiracy theories. Now it's time to go out and present inaccurate information. We stayed out of that process. And what happened in the aftermath of when more details began to emerge about this shooter, the alleged shooter, we saw social media filled with ties to Governor Walz and things that were done that were and connections that were tempted to be made. Armchair quarterbacks and armchair detectives trying to politicize this situation. We saw jokes about the Hortman home being broken into again today and being broken into after the shooting. And the ugliness came out in social media. And again, in this attention economy that a social media is, that gets clicks, that gets downloads, that gets stuff. But it is so inhumane. It is so inhumane. And I think about what was going on. You know, Becky, you were a staffer and I was a staffer, and we haven't dealt with these circumstances probably specifically. I can't imagine being a DFL staffer for the House or the DFL party and having to answer media calls based on rumor, gossip, and ugly innuendo that's being fueled by social media. And that's what they had to deal with. Their grieving space was violated and filled with wild, ugly conspiracy theories. And it's so unnecessary. But we do that. That's what social media has become. And what I'm going to try to do, and I'll defer to you what you try to do, but I'm going to try to let law enforcement lead this investigation. And when they have information that they want the public to know, they will release it. And I say that as someone who wrote a true crime book and got involved in investigation. But now is not the time, I think, for people to try to weaponize the tip and belief that they think in order to try to get some advantage in this situation. I think of the example of people that went out there and said, sadly, including a legislator or two, who went out there and tried to make the claim that the shooter's wife interned for Walz when he was in Congress. No factual basis, not true. But the internet is not, and particularly social media, in the aftermath of a tragedy. I said this long before this ugliness and this tragedy, that tragedy social media is the worst. And this is truly the worst. And what I've seen in social media in the aftermath of this has just been gross. And I would say, as much as I've tried to highlight my good Republican legislators who I think that have done amazing things, I think there's a lot of other people that I could have highlighted who didn't do that, because I don't want to do that right now. But I would simply say to folks, think before you post, and be thoughtful and considerate. You may not have ever met the Hortmans. You may not have ever met the Hoffmans. But imagine if your family member was assassinated and shot. Would you want people showing up and making jokes? Would you want people trying to politicize and weaponize the investigation and complicate it? I don't think you would. And so think about that right now as this happens, because the grieving process is going to take some time. There's going to be more anger we're going to see. People are going to go through this process in different ways, and we have to give that space. And I think that there is going to need to be a lot of space afforded for Democrats who were close to them to grieve, for there to be a thorough law enforcement investigation to go where it needs to go. And we also have to acknowledge that political violence is on the rise. And whether it's happening to Democrats or Republicans, we have a responsibility as Minnesotans to speak up and be a voice to ensure it doesn't continue.
And I think this goes hand in hand with your commentary last week, is less is more in this situation. Folks can just read the stories, watch what's going on. There's not always necessary to add your own commentary about what you've seen or what you've read or what you feel, especially when there are so many individuals hurting in this situation and will be for quite a while here. And so I think we can all kind of make internal goals to do better within our own friends and family and network, and to hope that ripple effect goes out. But let's let, like you said, the law enforcement do their job. We will know what we need to know when we need to know it. And regardless of any ties, connections, background, things we see on Reddit, what is being done is justice will hopefully be found, be sought. It's being sought. It's going through the proper channels it needs to go through. And we hope justice will be served in the names of Speaker Hortman, Mark Hortman, the Hoffmans, and Gilbert.
Thank you. I'm going to end this episode with a couple, again, of what people can do to help. Siri Everett with the DFL shared some GoFundMe links. I'm going to continue to promote them in this episode, share in the description of this episode, and share those on social media. I just want to add one additional thing. I did a bonus episode a day or so ago with Eric Mischie. Eric is the author of a new book called Go Fucking Do Something. That's the name of the book. Go Fucking Do Something. And as I said on the bonus episode, probably the most profanity-filled episode we've done. But when that's a book title, that's what it is. I thought Eric nailed the call to action, what his perspective was on social media. And I thought the message, which we had scheduled weeks ago, sadly, because of the circumstances, was perfect. And so I'm putting a plug in for Eric's book and that episode for people to listen, because his message, I think, is what a lot of us need to have right now. His perspective, blunt, raw, unfiltered. Those that know Eric, that's the way he is. But there is a lot of good in that message, and I hope people consider doing that.
Thank you for that, for sharing that. It certainly seems like an entertaining book, but one that we should all take to heart now more than ever. So go listen to that episode, go click on those GoFundMes, and try to do a little bit better.
That's right. Well, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website and follow us across all social media platforms at BB Breakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return with normal programming next week. Thank you so much, and our thoughts and prayers continue to be with you all.
Thank you.